Somewhere between 110 and 105 BC, a woman from the Han imperial clan was sent about 3,000 miles west, across deserts and mountain passes, to become the wife of a foreign king. She did not travel alone. The Hanshu, the official history of the Western Han dynasty, records that the court equipped her with imperial carriages, imperial robes and personal effects, and a staff of officials, eunuchs and attendants numbering in the hundreds. The same passage says the gifts sent with her were extremely lavish. The king accepted her and gave her a formal rank in his household. By every visible measure, this was a successful diplomatic marriage between two powers. And then the record says something that does not fit. It says that when the princess arrived in that country, she set up her own palace buildings and lived in them. It says she met the king once or twice a year, on which occasions food and drink were laid out, and she distributed money and silk to the nobles who attended him. It says the king was old. It says the two of them could not understand each other's speech, and it says that she was unhappy. Those 5 statements sit next to each other in a single short passage, in that order, with no explanation connecting them. A woman is sent thousands of miles to be a king's wife, and the first thing recorded about her life in his country is that she established a separate residence of her own. The second thing recorded is that she almost never saw him. This is not a story about a lost building. There is no floor plan of Princess Xijun's residence. There is no room-by-room description, no inventory of furniture, no securely identified archaeological site, and no ancient account of what its walls were made of. Anyone who tells you they can walk you through her bedroom is inventing it. What can be reconstructed is something more useful. Why a separate residence made sense given her actual position, who lived around it, what happened inside it, and what its existence reveals about the real purpose she was sent to serve. That reconstruction is what this account is about. The evidence base is narrow, and it is worth being precise about what it is. Almost everything specific about Xijun's life in Central Asia comes from a few dozen characters in Chapter 96 of the Hanshu, compiled in the 1st century AD by Bangu and his family from earlier Han court materials. A shorter related account appears in Chapter 123 of Sima Qian's Shiji, written closer to the events. There is no Wusun account. There are no letters. There is no independent source that can be set against the Han version to check it. Every fact that follows passes through the filter of a Chinese imperial history, written to explain and justify imperial policy. The passage in question reads, in its bare structure, the princess arrived in that country. She established palace buildings for her own residence. Once or twice a year she met the kunmo. Wine and food were set out. She gave money and silk to the king's nobles. The kunmo was old. Their speech did not connect. The princess grieved. The standard scholarly translation, by Hulsewe and Lowe, renders the crucial phrase as, her having buildings constructed for her residence. The text does not say she built anything with her own hands. It does not say anyone ordered her to build it. It simply records that the residence existed and that it was hers. So the question is not what the rooms looked like. The question is why a woman sent to be a king's wife needed her own establishment at all. To answer that, you have to understand why the Han Empire wanted her in that particular place badly enough to spend that much on getting her there. For most of the 2nd century BC, the Han dynasty had a northern problem it could not solve. The Xiongnu, a large steppe confederation, dominated the territory above and to the northwest of the Han frontier, extracted goods from the Han court through a series of negotiated arrangements, and raided when those arrangements failed. Under Emperor Wu, who came to the throne in 141 BC, Han policy shifted from accommodation to sustained military confrontation, and the campaigns of the 120s BC pushed Xiongnu power back from the Hexi corridor. Military success created a diplomatic opportunity. The envoy Zhang Qian, who had spent years as a Xiongnu captive before reaching Central Asia, returned with detailed intelligence about the peoples west of the Xiongnu. His argument to the emperor, as the histories present it, was that if the Han could pull the western peoples away from Xiongnu influence, the confederation would be cut off from its western support. The phrase preserved in the sources describes this as severing the Xiongnu's right arm. Around 115 BC, Zhang Qian was sent west again with a large mission, carrying livestock, gold and silk, specifically to open relations with one of those peoples, the Wusun. The Wusun mattered for concrete reasons. They occupied the Ili Valley and the adjoining ranges of the Tian Shan between the Xiongnu to the east and Kangju and Daiwan to the west, which put them on the flank of any Xiongnu movement into Central Asia. The Hanshu geographical entry records the state as having roughly 120,000 households, 630,000 people, and 188,800 men capable of bearing arms. Those figures are Han estimates and should be treated as approximations, but they describe a serious military power rather than a small tribe. The Wusun were also a major source of horses, which the Han cavalry needed and could not produce in sufficient quantity domestically. And the Wusun had a long, complicated relationship with the Xiongnu, having once been their vassals, and having risen to independence under the same king, who would eventually receive Xijun. The obvious question is why the Han sent a woman rather than simply an ambassador. Ambassadors had already gone. Zhang Qian went twice. Envoys carried gifts and proposals. What they could not create was kinship. Han marriage diplomacy, known as Hekin, was built on the idea that a treaty between strangers is weaker than a relationship between relatives. Sending a princess did not merely signal goodwill. It produced an affinal tie between the Han imperial house and a foreign ruling house, and it placed a permanent Han presence inside that ruler's own household. It also produced potentially an heir with Han connections. This was not a gift, it was an instrument, and it had been used repeatedly with the Xiongnu before it was used with the Wusun. The negotiation is recorded in some detail, and the details are revealing. The Wusun, alarmed by growing Han contact with their neighbors, sent envoys offering horses and asking for a Han princess so that the two states might become as brothers. Emperor Wu put the request to his ministers. They advised acceptance on one condition. The betrothal payment had to come first, and only then would the woman be sent. The Wusun paid 1,000 horses. Only after the horses arrived was Xijun dispatched. That sequence is worth holding on to. Before any of this became a story about a woman's life, it was a transaction with terms, a price, and an order of operations agreed by a committee of officials. The woman selected was Liu Xijun. She was the daughter of Liu Jian, king of Jiangdu, in the region of modern Yangzhou, and the granddaughter of Liu Fei, who was Emperor Wu's brother. She was therefore a member of the imperial Liu clan, but she was not the emperor's daughter, and she was not close to the center of the family. Her father had been destroyed. Liu Jian was implicated in a conspiracy against the throne and, according to the histories, took his own life. Her mother was executed in the same period on a charge of witchcraft. The standard reference literature on Han women observes that, as the child of disgraced parents, Xijun would have held a low status at the Han court. In 105 BC, or shortly before, her rank was raised and she was formally made a princess for the purpose of the marriage. It has been suggested by modern scholars that she was chosen partly because she came from a discredited branch of the imperial family and was therefore in no position to refuse. That is a plausible reading of her circumstances, and it fits the general pattern by which the Han court repeatedly drew Hekin brides from politically weakened lineages. Xijun's eventual successor, Jieyu, was the granddaughter of a prince who had joined a failed rebellion. But the sources do not state the reason for the choice, and the inference should be labeled as an inference. What the record establishes is narrower and still significant. The title of princess was conferred on her for the mission, not inherited from a secure position at court. This matters for how the rest of the account should be read. The word princess here does not describe a cherished daughter leaving the imperial palace with the emperor's blessing. It describes a rank assigned to a woman whose family had been eliminated in order to make her an acceptable representative of the Han house to a foreign king. Which raises the next question. What did the empire place around her to make that representation convincing? The answer is the reason the residence exists at all. The Hanshu lists what went with her: imperial carriages, clothing, and objects for imperial use, and a body of officials, eunuchs, and personal attendants numbering several hundred. The Chinese text specifies several hundred people, a figure that some English summaries have reduced to 100 through mistranslation. The account closes the list by stating that the send-off gifts were exceptionally rich. Anne Benke Kinney has read this level of investment as a deliberate development in Emperor Wu's marriage diplomacy. On her reading, the resources, personnel, and luxury goods were not sentimental provision for a young woman's comfort, but the material means of establishing her prestige and making political cooperation possible. She argues more broadly that the women sent on these missions should not be treated simply as passive tokens, since some of them, and the attendants around them, demonstrably acted politically once in place. Read that way, the list stops being a description of luggage. Several hundred officials and attendants is not an escort. It is a standing establishment. Those people had to sleep somewhere, eat somewhere, store the imperial goods somewhere, and carry out whatever functions they had been assigned somewhere. This is a functional inference rather than a documented fact, and it should be stated as one. But it is a well-supported inference because the alternative is implausible. A retinue of that size, attached to a woman who held formal rank in a foreign court and who was expected to host the king and distribute imperial goods to his nobles, required a physical base. The Hanshu sentence about her establishing her own residence and living in it is not a strange detail once the retinue is taken into account. It is close to a necessity. The environment she arrived in made that necessity sharper. The Wusun territory centered on the Ili Valley and the surrounding highlands, a region of river-fed grassland enclosed by mountains, well-watered by Central Asian standards, and capable of supporting large herds. Their royal court was at a walled settlement the Chinese sources call Qigu, whose exact location has never been established. The economy rested heavily on livestock, with horses of particular importance, and the population moved with the seasons between pastures. Archaeological work in the Ili region has confirmed a long history of mobility combined with agriculture, metalworking, and exchange, and a dense record of burial mounds spanning the Bronze Age through the Han period. Two cautions belong here. The first is that the Han descriptions of the Wusun are hostile in places. The Hanshu calls the people harsh and grasping and says the country was full of robbers, in the same breath as calling it the strongest state in the region. Those are the judgments of an imperial history written from Chang'an, and they should not be repeated as description. The second caution is archaeological. For much of the 20th century, scholars assigned nearly every find of the right date in the Ili region to a single Wusun culture. That practice has been criticized precisely because the Hanshu itself describes the Wusun as a state containing people of Saka and Yuezhi origin. The kingdom was a political entity holding several populations and traditions together, not one homogeneous group, and the material record should not be flattened to match a Chinese ethnonym. What can be said with confidence is that this was a mobile pastoral society with a different settlement pattern, a different diet, a different language, and a different court culture from the one Xijun had been trained in. A Han establishment of several hundred people operating inside it would have been conspicuous in every respect. So what do we actually know about the residence? We do not know its size. We do not know how many rooms it had. We do not know the building materials, the layout, the roofing, the colors, whether it had gardens, or what furniture stood in it. No structure has been securely identified as it. Every one of those questions is unanswerable from the surviving evidence, and every confident answer you will encounter is reconstruction presented as fact. What we know is a single clause in the Hanshu. On arrival, she established palace buildings for her own residence. We know what came west with her because the same chapter lists it. And we know what continued to arrive afterwards, because the text records that the emperor, having heard of her unhappiness, sent envoys every other year, carrying curtains or tent hangings and embroidered brocades. That last detail is more informative than it looks, and it is easy to overread. Hangings and brocade are furnishings. They suit a permanent building, and they equally suit a framed tent. The court was sending textiles, which were the standard Han diplomatic commodity, and also the standard Han furnishing material. Their arrival tells us the residence was being continuously supplied from Chang'an. It does not tell us what shape it was. The productive question is not what her bedroom looked like. It is what any residence would have had to contain in order to do the things the record says were done. Several hundred people had to be accommodated. Officials had to work. Imperial goods, including large quantities of silk, had to be stored securely because silk was currency at this level of diplomacy. Meals for the king and the Wusun nobility had to be prepared and served. Distributions of valuables had to be organized and, presumably, recorded. Whatever it looked like, it was not a bedroom. It was an operating establishment with a staff, a store, and a function. And that is the point at which the residence becomes genuinely interesting. Not because it might have been luxurious, which cannot be shown, but because it was a Han institution physically located inside the household of a foreign king whom two empires were competing to influence. Consider what the Han Shu says actually happened there. Once or twice a year, the princess met the Kunmo. Food and drink were set out, and she distributed money and silk to the nobles around the king. That last clause changes the character of the whole account. A newly arrived foreign wife handing valuables to the senior men of her husband's court is not domestic behavior. In a society where the ruler's power depended on the loyalty of a stratified nobility that maintained itself through tribute, plunder, and trade, the systematic distribution of high-value imported goods to that nobility was a political act. Han silk was among the most valuable portable commodities in Eurasia, and giving it away in that setting built obligation. This is exactly the function Kinney identifies when she reads the enormous investment in these princesses as being about prestige and political cooperation rather than comfort. The goods were sent so that they could be given away. The princess was the mechanism of distribution, so the way to understand the establishment changes. Before it looks like accommodation for a homesick young woman. After it looks like a residence, a resident Han staff, a store of imperial goods, a venue for hospitality directed at the local elite, and the physical point at which the Han-Wusun relationship was maintained. It is tempting to call that an embassy. The sources do not use any such term, and it would be an anachronism to impose one. But the functional overlap is real, and the question is a fair one to ask out loud. What should we call a permanent foreign establishment, staffed by officials of a distant government, funded from that government's treasury, resupplied by its envoys on a fixed schedule, and used to host and pay the host country's elite? Against that, set the marriage itself. The husband was Liejiaomi, whose title was Kunmo. The Hanshu is careful to explain the difference between titles and personal names in this royal house, noting that Kunmo was the royal title and Liejiaomi the name, and that his successor's designation, Chenzu, was likewise an office title, while the man's name was Jungsumi. The text takes the trouble to clarify this, which is a reminder that Han officials were working hard to understand a foreign political structure from the outside. Liejiaomi was old. He and Xijun could not understand each other's speech. They met once or twice a year. By any ordinary definition, this was not a marriage in daily practice. It was a formal status maintained by both courts, exercised at scheduled intervals, in a setting where the substantive activity was hospitality and the distribution of goods. And there is one further detail that removes any remaining ambiguity about what the arrangement was for. The Xiongnu sent a woman of their own to the same king. Liejiaomi made her his lady of the left. Xijun he made lady of the right, which in the ranking of that court was the junior of the two positions. There is no basis for turning these two women into personal rivals. Nothing in the record describes their relationship, and inventing hostility between them would be fiction. What the arrangement shows is structural, and it is more striking than any invented rivalry. The contest between the two dominant powers of Eastern and Central Eurasia was reproduced inside the household of a single Wusun king, with a Han woman in one position and a Xiongnu woman in the other, and the king holding both while committing fully to neither. The Wusun were not choosing a side. They were maintaining a balance, and the two consorts were the instruments of that balance. Xijun's separate residence looks different in that light. A woman whose function was to represent one of two competing empires inside a court that was deliberately keeping both at arm's length would have had reason to operate from her own base, with her own staff, holding her own supplies. Then there is the poem. The Hanshu attributes to Xijun a short lament, which it introduces by saying that because the king was old and their speech did not connect, the princess grieved and composed a song about herself. The content is straightforward. She says her family married her off to the far edge of the sky, sending her to a distant land and the king of the Wusun. She says a domed dwelling is her chamber, and felt her walls. That meat is her food, and fermented milk her drink. She says she thinks constantly of her own country and that her heart is injured. She ends by wishing she could become a yellow swan and return home. It is among the earliest Chinese poems attributed to a named woman, and it has been read for 2,000 years as her direct voice. There is an obvious problem with it, and the problem is the point. If Xijun had her own palace buildings, why does the poem describe her living in a felt tent? There are several possible explanations. The poem may be using conventional language for foreign, non-Chinese life, rather than describing her particular accommodation. She may be describing the Wusun world she was living within rather than the specific structure she slept in. She may have used different accommodation at different times, since her husband's court itself moved with the seasons. Or the poem may not preserve her words at all. That last possibility deserves serious attention. Martin Kern has examined how poems function inside Han historiography and shown that they appear repeatedly as dramatic voices attached to particular narrative moments, giving emotional expression to situations the historian wants the reader to understand in a certain way. On that reading, the lament attributed to Xijun does something specific within the Hanshu. It registers the human cost of Emperor Wu's expansionist policy from inside the official history of that policy. We cannot determine which explanation is correct. The evidence does not permit it. But the question that replaces the false certainty is a better one. When we read those 6 lines, are we hearing Xijun, or are we hearing the way Han historiography chose to remember what was done to her? Both are worth knowing. They are not the same thing. What the text does next is not in dispute, and it is where the whole account turns. The Hanshu says that the Son of Heaven heard of her sorrow and pitied her, and that every other year he sent envoys with hangings and brocade for her. He did not bring her home. The empire that could move several hundred people 3,000 miles, that could maintain a supply line of luxury textiles across deserts and mountain ranges on a fixed schedule, and that could reach her reliably enough to send comfort goods every second year, did not use any part of that capacity to do the one thing the poem says she wanted. She asked to go back. She received furnishings. There is no need to dramatize this. The reason is visible in the policy itself. Her value to the Han depended entirely on her remaining where she was. A princess recalled from the Wusun court is not an alliance. She is the public collapse of one, and the extent to which her own preferences counted becomes explicit shortly afterwards. Liejiomi, now very old, wanted his grandson and designated successor Chenzu to take the princess as his wife. This was not widow inheritance in the ordinary sense, because the old king was still alive. He wanted the transfer made while he lived in order to secure the arrangement past his own death, consistent with a broader step practice in which women remained within the husband's family. Xijun refused. The text is unambiguous. She did not comply, and she sent a memorial to the emperor setting out the situation. This is the one moment in the entire record where her own will appears and the sources in her own initiative, in a document she chose to send. The emperor's reply is preserved, and it is short. "Follow the customs of that country," he told her, "because we wish to join with the Wusun and destroy the Xiongnu." She complied. Chenzu took her as his wife. When Liejiomi died, Chenzu succeeded him. Xijun bore a daughter, named Shaofu, around 102 BC, and died shortly afterwards, probably in 101 BC. This is the real coercion at the center of the story, and it is documented rather than inferred. Nobody forced Xijun to construct a building. What was forced was something larger. The terms of her marriage, the identity of her husband, and the continuation of her presence in Central Asia were all subject to revision by a government 8,900 li away, on the basis of a strategic calculation about a third party. Which returns the question to the residents. What does it mean to have your own establishment, your own staff, your own store of imperial goods, and your own place to receive the most powerful men in the country, when the fundamental decisions about your life are made 3,000 miles away and delivered to you in a single sentence? The residents gave her a separate space. It did not give her any authority over her own circumstances. Those are different things, and the record lets us see both at once without inventing either. It is worth resisting the tidy ending that usually gets attached to this story. Xijun is often credited with securing decades of peace, opening the Silk Road, and single-handedly binding the Wusun to the Han. The evidence does not support any of that. What the record shows is that the policy continued because it had not finished working. After Xijun's death, the Han court sent another princess, Jiayu, to marry the same Chenzu. Jiayu remained among the Wusun for around 50 years, married 3 successive rulers, bore 5 children, and sent repeated appeals to the Han court for military assistance. Her attendant, Feng Liao, operated as an envoy in her own right among the states of the region. Around 72 BC, more than a generation after Xijun's death, the Han finally committed a very large army in coordination with the Wusun against the Xiongnu. If Xijun had settled the matter, none of that would have been necessary. The repetition is the evidence. Alliances of this kind were not single events secured by a wedding. They were processes that had to be maintained continuously, at enormous expense, by successive people placed in the same position she had occupied. Xijun was the first, and the first is not the same as the decisive. So return to where this started. She was sent to be a king's wife. She lived in her own separate establishment. She was surrounded by several hundred Han officials and attendants. She distributed imperial goods to a foreign nobility. She met her husband once or twice a year. She could not speak with him. She recorded, or had recorded for her, that she wanted to go home. She was refused. When she tried to decline a second marriage, she was overruled in a single sentence, citing strategy against the Xiongnu. She complied, and she died within a few years of arriving. The residence matters, and not because we can show it was the most magnificent building in Central Asia. We cannot show that, and nobody should claim it. It matters because its existence makes the actual nature of her position visible. She was supposed to become part of the Wusun court, and she arrived with a court of her own. She was supposed to become a wife, and she rarely saw her husband. She was given wealth on a scale few people in the ancient world ever handled, and no control over whether she stayed. She was given her own establishment, and no authority over the decisions that determined her life. The Han Empire proved it could transport almost everything a princess needed in order to represent an empire. Officials, silk, ceremony, carriages, a permanent supply line, and buildings to hold all of it, delivered across 3,000 miles of desert and mountain to a river valley in Central Asia. The single thing it did not send her, according to the only words that have come down under her name, was the road back.